Get 6 months of local news for just $2. You get unlimited access to the news and information you need to stay connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe to get 6 months of local news for just $2.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay, I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Welcome to Plain Talk. Our guest today, and he's been a guest with us previously. He's an associate professor at Ohio State University, Dakota Rudesill. Although he's got connections to North Dakota, he's a North Dakota guy. He's part of the North Dakota diaspora across in Washington D.C. They call it the North Dakota Mafia. All the North Dakotans that have infiltrated our federal government. Dakota's not one of those. But we wanted to have him on because he works in an area of academia that is focused on, I guess I would describe it, and Dakota could correct me, as sort of the use of federal law or federal power, federal authority. And obviously that manifests itself in many ways, but in the two ways that we're going to talk about it: law enforcement and military. Now, we're all watching what's going on in Minnesota right now, and ostensibly that is a very, very controversial, very aggressively prosecuted law enforcement action. That is the Trump administration's, but maybe they would dispute my characterizations of it as controversial and aggressive, but that's what they're doing. They have ICE in Minnesota. I have asked the question, and it's kind of why I wanted Dakota to come on, because my line of thinking has been in here, is the United States of America legally draws some very fine distinctions between law enforcement and military. And traditionally, we have strong protections against deploying the military domestically. Now, we've all seen the National Guard get used during natural disasters or things like that, and I don't think anybody finds that particularly controversial. I think where it comes into, and where my question is, though, is that when we have personnel who are dressed like soldiers, who are equipped like soldiers, who are using military tactics, not unlike what we would have seen in a place like Fallujah, to sweep neighborhoods, go door to door, has that definition between what constitutes the domestic law enforcement and military, has it eroded? So I wanted to bring Dakota on to talk a little bit about that as we all try to make sense of what's happening in Minnesota. Dakota, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. And I mean, what do you think? That is a place where my mind has been, and it bothers me because I feel like we're crossing some lines here. And I guess I just wanted to get, as an expert, as somebody who studies these things, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Delighted to be here. Yeah, I mean, so I think that this is something that is on the minds of a lot of Americans. And it's just, these times are super weird, right? In so many ways. And don't be alarmed. There's a siren. It's noon. There's a siren that goes off. It's a pest siren every Wednesday at this time. So nothing additional terrible has happened. No, so this is pretty strange. And so what you're getting at there is something which is really powerful in the American idea and American history, which is separation of the military and law enforcement, right? We've had these separate, and this norm goes back to the colonial period and goes back to the founding of the country, where one of the primary complaints of the colonists was that the occupying British force was essentially erasing this distinction. And the British Army was deployed within the colonies and was acting pursuant to what they called the general warrant, which means in the name of national security, right, of the king, right, they could enter any space, seize anything, search anything, and they could do so with impunity, right? That was a prime complaint of the colonists. And they said, right in the Declaration of Independence, you have elevated the military authority over the civil authority, right? Violated our privacy rights. And so
That's why we have the Third Amendment that gets overlooked a lot, but we have a Third Amendment against
Yeah.
quartering troops where the British would force Americans to basically house military, which I was not just a logistical thing. It was also a way of the British Empire of imposing sort of surveillance and control. If they've got the soldiers right in your home with you,
Yeah.
That exerts a certain amount of surveillance and control.
Yeah, that's right. So I actually teach the Third Amendment. I don't know how many law professors do, but I do, because it is very much about national security. As the whole Constitution is very much a national security document. There are more provisions of the Constitution that bear on use of force, the military, national security, freedom from state encroachment, right, than anything else. And so, First Amendment, free speech, free assembly, right to petition your government. Second Amendment, right to bear arms. Third Amendment, the government can't quarter their troops in your home without your permission, except in a time of war. Fourth Amendment, protection against searches and seizures, need a warrant based on probable cause. Fifth Amendment, nobody shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And I could go on, right? But the Constitution was forged from national security crisis and the highest level of government, right, encroaching on the liberty of the people in the name of national security. And so the framers wrote in that context, and they gave us the system we have, which is one where we have limited government, not unlimited government. We have limited government, limited federal powers. They're divided between the three branches. They're further limited by the Bill of Rights, which secures the rights of the people. You instead have the states, which are called governments of general jurisdiction over like health and welfare and things like that. And the framers gave the federal government the power to raise armies if they decided to do that, but they were very, very skeptical of the idea of having a standing army because they'd experienced the predations of the standing British army deployed in the communities of the colonists. And so instead, they said, basically, in extraordinary circumstances, the federal government could create a federal army, but what we're going to do is have the primary force be basically at the state levels, be the militia, which was basically the armed male citizenry. And the militia would be available to the state governments to do things like, disaster response, civil unrest response. The federal government could mobilize the militia under the Constitution, put it on federal duty to do federal stuff, which is defend the country from invasion, suppress insurrection, and enforce federal law as necessary. But that was enormously exceptional, and it was subject to Congress. The framers gave that power over the militia to Congress. So Congress would write the statutes that would even let the president do this and could write any limitations they wanted. And of course, the Congress, is the federal branch closest to the people, right, because of elections. In the founding era, the Congress enacted a number of statutes that would then give the president some authority to put the militia on federal duty, and in extraordinary circumstances, even use standing federal forces to do things. So one was there was the Militia Acts during Washington's term, and then in 1807, during Jefferson's term, they wrote the Insurrection Act. And basically what these say is that in really, really extraordinary circumstances, if there's, rebellion, right, that the state militias can be put on federal duty, and that even federal regular forces, like standing army forces, right, could be used to deal with that. Originally, as the framers, the founding generation, right, during those first presidencies, the way that they wrote this, and it got amended later, but initially, even after the president would try to call up, right, the militia and put them on federal duty, right, or use other forces, the president still had to go to a judge and convince the judge that there actually was insurrection, right? That was later dropped in some amendments in the 1800s, but what that reflects is just profound skepticism of the ability of government, and especially the federal government, right, to put men with guns into our community in the name of national security, right, or to suppress insurrection or something like that. Truly, truly exceptional.
So, Dakota, I was just thinking about this last night that we have a situation where Governor Walz has notified the National Guard in Minnesota to be prepared. We also know the Department of Defense and the administration has indicated there's 1,500 troops up in Alaska that they might move down into Minnesota. What happens here, right? I mean, what happens if Governor Walz pulls up the National Guard to protect the rights of Minnesotans while the federal government is also sending in troops from the active military? I mean, this has to be unprecedented, what we're looking at, certainly in modern times, but how
Mhm.
does this play out? I mean, it feels like the kind of brinksmanship we see in foreign policy between superpowers, not between a state and the United States.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly within our living memory, right? These are really, really extraordinary times, and just to so let me talk about this as a matter of law. So, under the Constitution, again, the Constitution gave the federal government for the first time the power to take the militia and to put that on federal duty. So, Congress would write a statute if it chose to do so, to give the president the authority to do that, and could put whatever any kind of conditions it wanted to on that. Um, and the modern professionalized version of the militia is the National Guard. And so states retain their baseline authority over the National Guard, right? So as a default, the National Guard is on state duty, working for the adjutant general, the senior military officer, working for the governor, subject to whatever law the legislature in the state legislates about. That's the default. And so Governor Walz, using his statutory authorities and constitutional authorities, can call out the Minnesota National Guard, right, to do things like protect the public, just to try to maybe separate protests, right, from the ICE officers. He certainly can't combat the ICE officers with the Minnesota National Guard, but do things like that, right, in addition to disaster relief and whatever else. The Constitution also says, however, again, that Congress can write statutes to give the president authority to put the National Guard on federal duty. And there are a number of those, but one of the central ones, again, is the Insurrection Act. And the Insurrection Act could allow the president to take the Minnesota National Guard basically away from Governor Walz and put that on federal duty, and then give that National Guard, any sort of number of orders, right? One order could be just go home, right? Another would now be to work for the president and do things for the president. And the president could additionally potentially send in federal regular troops. And so I think what is contemplated there is these regular army troops up in Alaska could be flown into Minnesota pursuant to an Insurrection Act invocation. So much of the attention at that moment as a legal matter would come down to whether the criteria in the Insurrection Act are satisfied. And this is I don't know what your metaphor is, a legal swamp, minefield, whatever you want to talk about it, right? Because so the Insurrection Act as it exists right now is what I describe it to my students as basically it's a snowball that's rolled downhill. And I mentioned there was a law under George Washington, one under Thomas Jefferson, and these have gotten amended over the time and picked up additional provisions. And so right now we basically have kind of three core provisions. And then there's another one that says before using this, the president has to issue a proclamation to disperse before invoking these authorities, right? And these three different provisions, one of them basically says that that a state which is experiencing domestic violence can request that the president send militia from other states to assist that state. Well, that's not what's going on here. Now we're on to the second one. The second one and the third ones are really the ones that are potentially operative here. And the problem is that Congress, in trying to combat white supremacist militia violence after the Civil War in the South, wrote those provisions of what now is the Insurrection Act in a very, very broad way. And it has been, thankfully, rarely invoked. The Insurrection Act, I think there have only been about 30 invocations in the entire U.S. history. The most frequent ones in recent history were in the 1960s for Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson to take Southern National Guards away from Southern governors, right, who were trying to basically defy the federal government, right, and the federal government's efforts to implement Supreme Court decisions and other court decisions against segregation. Basically, the Southern governors were trying to use their National Guards to keep racial segregation going. And so blue and red presidents invoked the Insurrection Act, took the state National Guards away from Southern governors, and then sent in federal forces to do things like, we're going to integrate the schools pursuant to court order, right? So that was the 1960s. Since then, the only time we've had the insurrection invoked since then was in 1992, when there was widespread breakdown in public order in Los Angeles, right? Massive citywide riots and destruction of property and looting and murder, right? President George H.W. Bush invoked the Insurrection Act and was able to mobilize National Guard and send in Marines and Army to restore order in LA. And it was brief and I think probably warranted. But the problem is that even though the Insurrection Act generally has been used in really extraordinary circumstances, like what we're talking about here, again, Congress in the late 1800s wrote it in a very, very broad way. And there's one of these provisions in particular, which is written in such a broad way that I think that if you were trying to be somebody who is maximally pushing your legal authorities, right, you could basically say that like any sort of conspiracy against federal power could justify invocation of the Insurrection Act, right? So like imagine two dudes, right, who are conspiring to cheat on their taxes. If you take a maximalist reading of the Insurrection Act, the president could send in the First Armored Division against those two dudes trying to cheat on their taxes, right? Obviously, that's ridiculous in the context of our constitutional values, right?
Well, and I think that
law
speaks
enforcement, military.
Because a lot of what we're talking about, like checks and balances, the 10th Amendment, the rights of states versus the rights of the federal government. I mean, that interplay, I mean, there's so much jurisprudence, there's so much legislation around that. It has been one of several, but one of the central preoccupations of our nation since its founding. But one of the places where it breaks down is what happens if one of the people, in this instance, the president, is acting in bad faith. To your mind, to choose to take a maximalist interpretation and go far beyond. Like Congress has delegated the executive branch these authorities to be able to use the military in extraordinary circumstances to restore order. And you cited some instances where I think everybody on this call would agree were appropriate, enforcing civil rights legislation and Supreme Court jurisprudence against southern states that at the time I think you could say are acting in bad faith and trying to block something, or the riots in Los Angeles, as you just noted, probably a prudent thing to just get in there, try to calm things down and stop the violence. So that hopefully we can move forward. But in this instance, it doesn't feel like good faith. Like this does not feel like a good faith use. This seems like somebody who is trying to pick fights, somebody who is trying to create rancor, not calm things down, but create rancor. I would argue the way and so it just, I don't know. I mean, it seems like that's where our system breaks down, is at some point, if one of the cogs in the checks and balances just decides to stop acting in good faith, what do you do?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. So I'll say two things about that. So number one, the way that the framers contemplated this is that people who are elected to Congress, or in the case of the Senate back then, appointed by the state legislatures, they would play their constitutional position, because the framers they wrote the Constitution before there were political parties. I mean, people had all sorts of different opinions on stuff, and you had little factions. You had factions on things like North.
Well, the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians, they had different
Yeah.
ideas about standing armies and all that stuff.
Yeah, right. But you didn't have, but the parties only emerged during President Washington's after the Constitution was in effect. And so they didn't. But what they assumed was that people in Congress would have primary faith to the overall civic interest of the country and would play their constitutional position, and they would be skeptical of encroachment by the other branches, right? And they would be very, very protective, right, of the Constitution and the general public good, in a context where the framers really, when you read the Federalist Papers, like my students and I do, they were worried about too much legislative power under the design that they had. if anything, because they just thought that, well, Congress is going to be so active, right, and so protective of liberty and the constitutional design, right? But what we've had now with this really, really rigid partisan politics, right, is, a Congress which has been, just remarkably deferential, right? Like, and Rob, I know you've written about this so much. Look at the traditional Republican Party in America, right? And their commitments about like how separation of power should work and individual liberty and public accountability and morality, right? You look at that from like 10 years ago and where we are today, the amount of deference we've seen from Congress, right? So that's number one.
Well, yeah, and I would argue also, though, the amount of deference from the voters. I mean, I would say that even upstream from Congress's being deferential are voters. I mean, if you polled, and I have seen recent polling, President Donald Trump is still very, very popular in North Dakota.
Hmm.
I would have to imagine that the message, if a Julie Fedorchak or a Senator Kevin Cramer, or Senator John Hoeven were contemplating leading a congressional push to try to rein in and maybe remove some of the congressional or maybe even just more closely define some of the executive authority that President Donald Trump is using, I think that they would get enormous pushback from a critical mass of North Dakota voters because they're fine with it, because the person wielding the power is Donald Trump. Now, as Joe Biden wielding the power, I suspect that they would feel differently. But that seems to be where we are as a country right now, and it speaks to the partisanship you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, traditionally, as you think about government and power, right? Traditionally, the thing you need to do is you need to think, okay, if we're going to give government this a power, right? You have to, number one, think about, okay, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve right now? And then your immediate second question is going to be, now, let me imagine this power in the hands of the people I would never want to have, right?
Right.
And then you go back and you change your draft to really tighten it up, right? To make sure. And so, I just say, like, if you are fine with, a federal domestic standing army, right, which is not the professionalized National Guard, not the professionalized U.S. Armed Forces, right, and all of their civic norms and, just everything that goes with that, right, rules and regulations about how they operate domestically, like it's thick, right? Instead, we have this new ICE thing, right, which is basically a new federal domestic army, right, which, as you watch them, if you know about how police operate, military, they are undisciplined, they are barely trained, they are extremely aggressive, right? And from so many of the comments that they've made to people that they've detained, right, they sound like really highly ideological and partisan. And then now we have, the top people in the executive branch saying that they have complete immunity for anything they do, right? So, I mean, so let's just look at this, right? So you've got like a barely trained, barely disciplined, right, new army of dudes in cities with machine guns, and they've just been told you have complete immunity, right? I'm thinking about the conservative humorist.
And if a protester gets in your way, they're a terrorist.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking about like the great conservative humorist PJ O'Rourke, who I always loved reading, and he said, giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenage boys. And
I will say that as a conservative, it has been remarkable, and it would be more humorous were the context different, to watch my liberal friends suddenly regain an appreciation for the 10th Amendment.
Yeah.
That conservative. I was laughing. The North Dakota Monitor ran a story about Minnesota, and they had to put a disclaimer in there about, like, okay, Tim Walz is invoking the 10th Amendment, but it's okay when Tim Walz does it, even though the 10th Amendment was invoked and states' rights were invoked by racists of another era who were trying to fight off civil rights legislation. Like the left invested itself so thoroughly in the idea that the 10th Amendment was only used by secessionists and racists. And how dare, you get in touch with the growth of the all-powerful federal government. I got to think there's a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberals that are regretting the amount of consolidation of authority that they've promoted in the federal government right now that Donald Trump is the one wielding that power.
Hey, Dakota, can I, before we get, I know we're running up against it, and I want to get to another question really quickly. And that is, we've talked about maybe that there's not some honest brokers that are participating in this process right now, but there's a lot of human beings who are making decisions. And you sent us an article about a specific North Dakotan who stood up to illegal stuff. There was one human being doing what's right, and I think
Yeah.
I find the story inspiring at this time, and I would love if you talk a little bit about your great uncle and the work that he did back in World War II.
Yeah. So thanks for mentioning that. Yeah. So I wrote an essay in the State Bar Association of North Dakota magazine. It came out last spring. You can find it online. And it's a short essay about Sergeant Peter Granlund. If you want to Google it, Granlund, Sergeant Peter Granlund. So he was Fort Ransom, North Dakota, class of 1944. And joined the army like everybody did, right out, during the war, and was trained and sent to Europe and arrived there after D-Day. And he was involved in months of the most intense combat between the U.S. Army and the German military, and they fought professional German Wehrmacht, and they fought SS Panzers, and just it was the most intense stuff. It was the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, and then the Battle of the Bulge, and then the push over into Germany. And my great uncle Pete Granlund, 19 years old, 18 and 19 years old, was at the very tip of the bloody tip of the spear, month after month of grueling combat, and a hero many times over. And he was also a deeply just good man. But I would also say it's just common decency. And I just and the one particular incident that I wrote about in that essay was during the push into Germany. And again, right at the front end of it, Pete was walking forward at the front end of the U.S. advance, and out of a trench, this group of Germans stood up and surrendered. They threw their weapons down, threw their hands in the air. They surrendered to him. And Pete said that they had a new lieutenant in their unit. And he called back to the lieutenant and said, like, okay, Lieutenant, what's the plan for these guys? Right? Thinking like, do I hold them now? Do we have somebody else who's taking POWs? Are we handing them off to another unit? Like, what's the plan? Right? And the lieutenant said, kill them. And Pete, who'd been trained on the rules of engagement, which are informed by the law of war, and are just our civilizational moral commitments, right, to not directing force at prisoners. This is just foundational in the law of war, right? Not directing force against harm, against helpless people. Well, he refused to comply. It was a manifestly illegal order, and he wouldn't do it. And he thought, well, at that moment, I could, maybe this lieutenant is going to execute me or something like that. Thankfully, the lieutenant just let it drop. But what a moment, right? Like, here's this 19-year-old kid, right, who's been fighting the Nazis for 3 or 4 months. He wrote in his memoir, all his friends were like, every friend he'd made was dead, right? Think about the animus he had towards the Germans, but they surrendered. He was given a plainly illegal order and he refused it, right? I mean, talk about moral courage. And I look at that and I look at some of the conversation we're having today. And number one, just the lack of courage that so many people are demonstrating in so many circumstances for standing up for what they know is right, and speaking out against things that are wrong. And then also this conversation we're having about legal and illegal orders. And now we have a Secretary of Defense who has basically made his new motto, maximum lethality, not tepid legality. Basically saying our priority is just killing people, and law doesn't matter. Well, I look at that, and I think of Sergeant Granlund and the courage that he had in pushing back against that.
I think so much of it comes down to, you can have all the laws in the world, but they're kind of like money, right? Why is a dollar bill worth a dollar? Well, it's because we all agree on it, right? We all agree that if you give me $1, I'll give you $1 worth of goods and services. Well, the law is the same way. The law only matters.
Yeah.
It only restrains people's behavior if we agree to follow it, and if we agree that breaking it has consequences, and we enforce those consequences. If the people who are in key positions just agree to, or even the voters, because again, I am not for letting the voters off the hook. One of the reasons why Congress has acquiesced the way it has, I would argue, is because vast swaths of the American public want that. And that is terrifying. If we don't stand up for the rule of law, then nobody will. And then it's lawlessness, and law is whatever the person with the most, who commands the most guns, I guess, says it is.
Yeah.
And that's a terrifying, terrifying thing. Dakota,
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming on. So
You
much
bet.
of this stuff is murky and emotionally fraught and difficult to talk about. But it's important discussion. I'm glad you came here to share it with us.
Always a
Thanks,
pleasure.
Dakota.
All right.
Hey, Plain Talk listeners, have something to say? Call or text Plain Talk with your questions, comments, or headlines you want us to cover.
Just dial 701-587-3141. Leave us your message or shoot us a text with your name and location, and you could be featured on an upcoming show.
Hi, my name is Ashley, and I am in Jamestown.
Hey, Rob and Chad. My name's Tony. I live in Grand Forks.
That's 701-587-3141.
Call us, text us, vent, praise.
We want you in the conversation. Thanks for being part of the show.
Now let's get back to today's episode.
Let's finish up our interview with Professor Dakota Rudesill, which is, really kind of talking about first principles in terms of American ideas. I mean, these are again central debates that we have been having since Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were going at it hammer and tongs over standing armies and everything. And again, Chad, it really worries me. I mean, at the end of the day, what has made America what it is that that's what most Americans have wanted. And I worry that we're going to get some of these terrible things not because Donald Trump necessarily is doing it to us, although he's the instrument, and not because Congress is doing it, although they've acquiesced, but because the people want it, or at least enough people want it to make it possible politically.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And we've talked a lot about how much blame the voters deserve. I do think that there's been some slippage in Trump support in North Dakota, but it's still well over 50%. And the question becomes, this is what they want. I mean, the military action in Minnesota, what's happening with Greenland, which I talked to all my friends who are like, what the hell's like Greenland? What's happening here? I just watched some of the coverage of the stuff that's happening is it Davos?
Yeah.
And it's just like he's going up there and just smacking every one of our partners in the face. I mean, we've got some sort of some like relationships that like we need these relationships. And
Well,
so
also,
I'm just sort of scared about what's the new normal.
Well, I mean, the bond market is what really scares me right now. The news that Denmark sold off from their national pension, they held $100 million in American debt, which in terms of our overall debt is a rounding error, unfortunately, but still is a troubling sign because our ability to finance our spending relies on people buying those bonds, whether it's Americans or foreign governments or sovereign wealth funds or whatever. Traditionally, buying American debt was seen as a good investment because we're a stable country. We pay our debts and we have a stable democracy and very strong economy. And I worry that not only, are we destroying alliances and NATO and everything, but it doesn't get less politically dispassionate than the bond markets.
Yep.
Right? The bond investors aren't going to be intimidated by Donald Trump going on Truth Social and putting them on blast. They don't care.
Right.
What they care about is a return. And can America make good on its returns? Increasingly, we don't look like a good investment, and that should give Americans pause.
Yeah, we look like an unstable business. We look like an unstable investment.
But I think, especially when you were talking about younger Americans not knowing anything different than what this is, I think you could even expand it. I think there's generations of Americans who grew up in a post World War II era of Pax Americana, where, like it or not, America was kind of the world police. We were, when international diplomacy needed to happen, we were always involved because we were a trusted broker. I'm not saying that we're perfect or that we're angels, that we've done everything right, but we've always been about as trusted a broker as you could have on the international stage. We have always been about as trusted an investment as you could have. Always been. We have been certainly, since in the post World War II period. And I'm worried that that's coming to an end. And I think that there's people who think it can't end, that this is just the normal and it's always going to be this way. And America's always going to be at the top of the heap. And we're always going to have all this influence and economic might. And the thing is, we can give it away. Yeah. It can end. And I think we have generations of what they call, Game of Thrones, they called Summer's children, who don't know that we have never seen a winter in our lifetimes. And we may be about to provoke one that didn't need to happen.
And we saw we saw the Prime Minister of Canada yesterday just talk about, like, we can do this differently, right? This agreement that we have as a world community. The United States isn't part of it anymore. They're not being a fair actor as part of this. And they've started to, reach out to China and work with China on things. That's not good for us if our closest allies are now working with China and other places. And the fact that we're even in a conversation about who do we trust more, is it China or the United States? That's a problem. We live in a global world more now than ever. We can't be isolationists. We can't just think that we're the big dog and that everybody's just going to listen to us.
And that they all have to dance to our tune, or we're going to give up. I mean, listen, I don't have a problem with America flexing its economic muscle or military muscle in pursuit of our objectives, but there's an upper limit to that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, we have to be trusted actors. And when the president, he's not even consistent within his own set framework of ideas. Right? He's all over the map. He's mercurial. And it's like whatever he wakes up, you may wake up in the morning and find out he went on a tirade on social media and now everything's different. And old allegiances are gone and old deals are over because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize or something.
Yeah. And I think, flexing our muscles is great for a goal, as you pointed out, but trying to flex our muscles to take Greenland. Right. It doesn't make any sense.
When I say flexing our muscles, it's just normal international. Right. All the countries do it. Do it. America should be an advocate for what's best for America first and foremost. I absolutely believe.
But we have to have a plan on what that looks like. It can't just be.
I don't think destroying NATO is good for America. I don't think becoming a bad actor and allowing China or Russia or another even probably a less a less objectionable nation replace us in that central seat in where that's not a good thing. I would like to be the trusted America again. That's what I would like to be.
And I don't know how we become the trusted America when Trump is leaking text messages and conversations he's having with other world leaders. Why would any world leader want to deal with him if they don't know what he's going to decide to do from one day to the next? It makes no sense.
It doesn't. Speaking, I will say, and I brought it up, that North Dakota Monitor, and it was one, I think it was one, their Minnesota newsroom, and they republished it or whatever, but I laughed out loud and I mentioned it in a column. I laughed out loud when I got to that segment where they had to put a disclaimer. Well, the 10th Amendment's typically used by racists and secessionists, but it's okay now that Minnesota's using it. And it's yes, that part of law was used by bad actors, but it's still the law.
Yeah.
I don't know how many years I spent being accused of being a secessionist and a racist and everything, because I felt that I didn't want the federal government to just steamroll the states. And I'm having a grand old time watching my liberal friends come full circle and be like, welcome to the conservative movement, or at least what used to be the conservative movement.
That's the problem. I think you might be a liberal now.
I'm not a liberal.
Well, in today's, maybe all the conservatives have left you and they think the federal government should take over the state of Minnesota.
I've always been, I've always told people I've always told people that I am a classical liberal. That used to be a popular thing that conservatives would say. I'm a classical liberal, not a big L Democrat liberal, but a classical liberal in the sense that I believe in, pluralism. I believe in, free speech, free expression, representative government, right? That's the sort of liberalism I'm for. And then within that context, we can have debates about whether or not the state ought to pay for school lunches or whatever. But I just, we've lost that. There's people, it's just might makes right. And we're going to seize power and then jam our agenda down the throats of the other side. Both sides have been doing it.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is by far the worst perpetrator of it. But here we are. And we've erased so many of our checks and balances, or we've blurred the lines, smudged the lines so much that they're not protecting us anymore.
And Congress has given up all of their power. I don't know how
they're not even trying.
Yeah, the Republicans in Congress, I don't know how they can push back against a Democrat president. They will. But it's the hypocrisy on both sides. And I think you're concerned about Newsom. I mean, I kind of like Gavin Newsom right now. I don't like the tactics he's using. But are we going to just fall into the same thing? But on the
I hope, and I don't mean to be mean to Gavin Newsom. I don't know what he would do.
He's certainly playing the same game that Trump has played.
At least rhetorically, yeah, he's playing the same. He's playing the Trump game, and that people like it, and I guess that's what gives me a lot of. Aside from the fact that ideologically he's a liberal and I'm not, and he would probably promote a lot of policy agendas, but that's fine. That's democracy. I don't want a left-wing Trump. I don't want what follows Trump to be a left-wing Trump.
Right.
Because that doesn't solve the problem that we're facing, and it doesn't suddenly make abuses of executive power okay because they're in pursuit of a liberal policy agenda, progressive policy agenda.
Yeah, and I don't to your point. I thought we were getting a not left-wing Trump and Joe Biden, but turns out it was just a really old guy. And so I would like a not left-wing Trump who also can do the job and can sit in the Oval Office and do the job. And
is younger. I mean, you really have to wonder with Trump. I mean, I don't want to say that Trump doesn't like the things that are happening, but how much of this is Stephen Miller?
Yeah,
how much
I don't know, but I will say on the old thing, I watched Trump's press conference yesterday. I don't watch a lot of Trump. But if you were concerned about Joe Biden's mental capacity and you watched that press conference yesterday and you're not concerned about Donald Trump's mental capacity, you're a hypocrite because he couldn't finish a thought. He was all over the place. It was,
he's generally more vigorous. He's not as physically frail as Biden was at the end. And he's certainly more vigorous and energetic, but the coherency, the cognition is not there.
Yeah,
not there. And you talk about the leak of the Greenland messages. Part of what he leaked was him whining, saying, basically telling the Norwegian, give me a Nobel Peace Prize, which, by the way, it's not in the power of the Norwegian government to give. But he's saying either recognize my peacefulness or I'll start a war. What?
Yeah.
What? Accepting, and I feel so bad for the Venezuelan opposition leader who gave up her Nobel Prize to him. I understand what she's trying to do. I think it's probably misguided. It's probably not the choice I would have made, but I get it.
Yeah.
Her country's in a terrible, terrible position. But what person accepts it?
Yeah.
What person oh, thank you.
But I think that was I don't know if you saw the speech from the Canadian Prime Minister, but I mean, that was sort of his point to the world. We need to stop just being the people who sort of, try to get him to like us or do little things to try to like us. This guy is going to be bad to our countries. We need to start standing up for ourselves and naming it. Because I agree with you. I think the Nobel Peace Prize winner was trying to do right by our country and whatever. But he's like a child who's not satisfied. Give an inch, take a mile sort of thing. There's no loyalty there. And so I would like to see the world stand up to him. I'd like to see our Congress stand up to him a little bit as well. I'd
like to see our state stand up to him.
Yep.
I support Minnesota's lawsuit is a very interesting legal. I read the filing. I think it's a very interesting legal question. I would have liked to see more focus on what is it? How are we defining military versus law enforcement? Because again, when the law, quote unquote, law enforcement are kitted out like soldiers, and when their commanders are using the language of war, and they're using military tactics, how are they still law enforcement? I think that's an important question for the courts to answer.
Yep.
And I think Minnesota should have asked it more, but I completely support what Minnesota's doing, just as a question of what are the upper limits of the federal government's ability to go into a state and disrupt in the way that they're doing.
And you saw the elderly Hmong gentleman who was pulled out of his house in his underwear and flip flops, and turns out he was a citizen. Why can that guy not sue the federal government for that kind of behavior? It I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know what to do. And by the way, our friends in the law enforcement community, I think you should be very concerned about what this is doing to you, because like it or not, the public is going to view law enforcement monolithically. And I know there's a lot of people out there who back the blue and whatever law enforcement wants to do. This is eroding your trust, the trust that the communities that you serve have in you. This is hurting you. You should not be cheering this on. The way they are acting is unprofessional. It is unbecoming. It is, I would argue, illegal in many ways and unconstitutional. I mean, they're exercising a level of police power that eventually there is going to be a backlash, and it is going to put you, I don't want to say put you in harm's way, but put you in an untenable situation.
Well, I don't know if you saw the press conference. A bunch of Minnesota police chiefs did have a press conference basically to say ICE is making us look bad. And then they told some stories about off-duty police officers who were harassed by ICE and brought in. And like, it's
Well, some
again,
of the stuff
powder
too,
keg.
like real IDs won't matter. Like if
Yeah.
they stop me and say that I'm not a citizen, and I'll be honest with you, Chad, I don't have an active passport. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not that worried about it because I'm a big old hairy white guy, and I'm just not the person that they're going to target. They're not going to
Exactly right.
target me. They're not going to target me. They may target our friend Hamida Dakane because she speaks with an accent and she dresses in her traditional way, which is her right as a human being, an American. But because of those things, she may be targeted. And
Even
she
though
may
she
have
is
to carry her papers
just
around.
as much of a citizen as you or I. And
Right.
that's the biggest problem.
She's not,
This-
she's
this
not in
is
a
not
separate
America.
category. She's not in a separate category. She is an American and should be treated by our law enforcement and by our government in the same way that you and I are, Chad. But let's face it, she has something to fear in this environment that you and I do not.
Absolutely.
And that is an injustice.
Yeah.
That
It's
is
an injustice,
un-American.
and it's not foundationally, it's not what this country is founded on.
No.
I mean, if
And
you
I say that fully recognizing all the ways that America over the years has fallen short of the things that it aspires to be. We
Of
are not a
course.
perfect place. We are not a perfect country, but we're not even aspiring to it anymore when
Yep.
we're doing that stuff.
Yeah, if law enforcement and ICE comes in and just starts to pull any person who's brown out of a car because they look like they might not be a citizen, I don't know how we recover from that.
I have spent years to people on the right, the back the blue sign saying a police state is not a good thing. It is not a place you want to live. And yet there are people who seem convinced there's no limit to this power because it's being exercised against the people that I don't like.
Right.
And if it annoys Tim Walz, then it must be okay. That is a really bad way to evaluate public policy. Okay, we're going to end it there. The special session, by the time you'll be listening to this, I guess Chad and I are recording this on Wednesday, so we don't know how the special session is going to end up. I hope it's brief. I hope by the time this publishes, it's either done or being wrapped up.
And I
And
hope we have universal meals.
I hope the meals bill passes to avoid us a ballot measure, save everybody some time and money, and just do the thing that the most of the public want to do. But yeah, the legislative session will be interesting. The rest of it's pretty boilerplate. I think the big debate to watch is going to be the meals bill. That'll be very interesting. So hopefully it came out the right way. Those of you listening to this in the future, you'll know. We don't know right now. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you can always participate in the show if you want to call or text 701-587-3141. We'll play your audio. We'll read your text message during the show and respond to it. So if you've got reactions to what we're talking about, or you got questions you want to ask us, please avail yourself. 701-587-3141. plaintalknd.com is also the place to go. Basically reroutes to our YouTube profile, which is just a great place. We've got the clips from the shows. If you don't have time to watch the full show, you can watch some clips. We've got the interviews, we've got the commentary, we've got the full episodes. It's all there. Tune in for that. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk again. That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Leave us a voicemail or send us a text message at 701-587-3141. That's 701-587-3141. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening.